All right, welcome back in here to Live Now from Fox. I am Andy Mack. We're learning new information about the ongoing conflict in Iran as approximately 140 U.S. service members have been wounded in the first 10 days of this conflict, which is a significant jump from what we knew over the past week. We heard from Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth earlier on today, providing an update, saying today will be the most intense days of U.S. strikes in that region. For more on this, let's go out to Jennifer Griffin that gets us up to speed.
Targets struck, 50 Iranian naval vessels sunk, but Iran continues attacks on Gulf countries.
Are they more formidable than you anticipated, General?
I think they're fighting, and I respect that, but I don't think they're more formidable than what we thought.
The two biggest pressures on President Trump, the rising cost of oil and the strain on stockpiles of expensive munitions. The U.S. military used more than 150 of the 534 THAAD interceptors during last summer's Iranian operation. The 2026 defense budget adds only 37 more to the arsenal.
We risk getting into a very precarious situation, one that could invite or tempt somebody like China.
President Xi of China has set 2027 as the year in which his military should be ready to take Taiwan by force if necessary. The U.S. Navy will need missile defense systems for its bases throughout the Pacific, its Navy warships and long-range missiles to defend Taiwan and deter China. President Trump says the U.S. military has a limitless stockpile of weapons, but also met with key defense contractors last Friday and pressed them to quadruple production.
But we have unlimited middle and upper ammunition, which is really what we're using in this war. And we have really an unlimited supply.
The Pentagon spent $5.6 billion in munitions during the first 2 days of the assault, according to lawmakers briefed on Capitol Hill, and will need at least a $50 billion supplemental from Congress.
We need to be all in and finish the job. I've never been more impressed with a military operation than I am at Epic Fury.
I emerged from this briefing as dissatisfied and angry, frankly, as I have from any past briefing in my 15 years in the Senate.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky sent a team of Ukrainian counter-drone experts to the Middle East to show the Gulf states and Jordan how to defend against Iran's Shahed drones, which Russia fires at Ukraine almost every night. Axios first reported a Ukrainian team offered to provide the U.S. with its counter-drone technology to defend bases in the Middle East during a meeting last August at the White House between Presidents Trump and Zelensky, but the Pentagon did not follow up. In Washington, Jennifer Griffin, Fox News.
All right, thank you so much for that. And one of the main pressure points is around oil. And yesterday, President Trump said this conflict may end very soon. That calmed some nerves. But new developments today about potential reports that the Iranians may put mines in the Strait of Hormuz to deter some of those vessels moving through the region. And President Trump responded in kind with this response, saying if Iran puts those mines into the Strait of Hormuz, and we have no reports of them doing so, we want them removed immediately. For any reason mines were placed, they are not removed forthwith. The military consequence to Iran will be a level never seen before. All right, let's continue on here on Live Now from Fox. Bring into the conversation Director of the Middle East Program at the Defense Priorities. Thank you so much for joining us here on Live Now from Fox, Rosemary Kelanic. We talk about the Strait of Hormuz so very much right now. And is Iran using this energy artery more so as a bargaining chip or as a weapon right now?
I'd say it's both right now. I mean, weapons are often bargaining chips at the same time. And Iran is using it as a weapon. But of course, they can reverse their attacks on the Strait anytime they see fit. And if the United States, ceases its hostilities, perhaps Iran would decide to do that, perhaps not. There's a lot of speculation right now about, whether or not, even if President Trump decided to end the war, whether or not Iran would agree to end the war, because of course they want to reestablish deterrence. They feel the need to convince the region, convince the United States, convince Israel that they can strike back hard and might continue to do so in Hormuz and elsewhere in the region.
And we've seen just the note that mines might be present has deterred vessel, as this has slowed to a very trickle there in this chokehold, this choke point of a region. What is it signaling to you that Iranians might be using mines in this? Are they leaning into the fact that this is putting a lot of pressure on the United States and President Trump?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely, they are. And, it's an interesting signal because it signals that they might continue this crisis for a long period of time, or they might continue targeting shipping in the Strait for a long period of time. So Iran doesn't need mines to harass vessels in the Strait. They can do that with missiles. They can do it with drones. They can do it with speedboats that have explosives on them. They can do it with limpet mines where they pull up in a speedboat, attach it to the hull of a tanker, and then speed away. The fact that they're visibly laying mines in a way that the United States can see them doing it, or at least U.S. intelligence has detected it, right? That's signaling that they're willing to keep fighting for a longer period of time because, of course, it takes time to clear mines.
And it takes time to lay them, and it clears them. We are playing some video there from Central Command, U.S. Central Command, noting that they have destroyed some 16 Iranian mine layers there in that region. But just the U.S. Navy might be involved. We heard from Energy Secretary Chris Wright. He posted on social media, and then the White House had to clarify that there was actually no U.S. Navy ships kind of chaperoning, escorting vessels through the region. Will the U.S. Navy get involved, and how much of a logistical challenge might that be in the Strait of Hormuz?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult because it puts U.S. naval assets at risk. If U.S. naval assets tried to escort ships through the Gulf, through the Strait, they're at risk. If they try to put minesweepers or LCS ships, littoral combat ships, which have minesweeping capabilities in the Strait, those are put at risk of Iranian attack from the shore. And this is a scenario that Iran has been planning for literally for decades. So it is a difficult military problem. That said, the threat to tankers from mines and the threat to tankers from Iran's attacks are generally overestimated. It's very difficult to sink a tanker. It's even difficult to total a tanker to make it a total complete loss. But the fact of the matter is, Iran doesn't have to sink tankers to frighten shippers into avoiding the Strait. And so the big question going forward is, how long are these attacks going to continue? And then whether or not the market adapts in certain ways where they agree, shippers, insurance companies agree to assume more risk, which of course will cause prices to increase because risk is expensive to price in. But whether that risk could be priced in over time, as it was, during the Iran-Iraq War, for instance, when tankers were targeted during that conflict.
Are we learning anything from history? You mentioned the Iran-Iraq War, maybe dating back to the Islamic Revolution. Is there anything to be learned from history, and how similar might it be in some of these circumstances? Because the Strait of Hormuz threatened to be shut down before. It hasn't really ever come to be. Are we learning anything from the past?
Well, we should be. I mean, there's lots of stuff to study in the past that we should learn from. And of course, the origin of this, right, this being the U.S. military commitment to the free flow of Persian Gulf oil, came in the late 1970s when the Islamic Revolution happened in 1979. Then shortly after that, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. And that made Washington very worried that the Soviets might then try to go into Iran at a time of weakness in Iran and maybe cut off the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz then. And so Carter, in his 1980 State of the Union address, said explicitly the U.S. won't allow that to happen. The U.S. is going to, commit its military forces to preserve the free flow of Persian Gulf oil through the Strait. Now, he didn't have the ability to do it at the time because the U.S. didn't have forces in the region. But by doing that, Carter essentially created a moral hazard problem for the market. So just for geographic reasons, a lot of oil was going to flow through the Strait. But Carter essentially made the Strait of Hormuz too big to fail. Right. And it wasn't an implicit security guarantee. It was an explicit security guarantee. So if you're a market actor and you think that the U.S. government is going to protect oil shipping through the Strait, well, gee, you're not going to invest in finding other ways of getting oil out of the Persian Gulf. And so years went by where countries could have built more pipelines to the Red Sea and to the Mediterranean, and they did not do that because the U.S. made this commitment. And so that's a somewhat perverse consequence of the commitment itself. And the wisdom of that commitment back then, I think the wisdom of it today is up for debate, frankly.
Yeah, it's so very pivotal to everything that goes on in the region, whether this conflict is happening or not. I do want to just kind of note that it was interesting because I was reading one of your articles talking about U.S. Central Command. It was actually formed. We're seeing the videos now, but it was formed because of what was going on in 1979, and it's kind of replaying itself here in this way. How different is it, though, from where U.S. Command was formed to where we are now? How different are the kind of groundwork for the United States?
So, the situation is different in a lot of ways. The United States now has a huge military presence in the Persian Gulf. And that presence was there in many ways to sort of uphold the commitment. But I think what we've seen recently is that the huge numbers of bases in the region are actually a strategic liability, right? They're a vulnerability. We've put our forces in easy missile and drone distance of Iran. And despite the fact that the U.S. put forces in the region, that has not deterred Iran from targeting shipping through the strait. So, in many ways, the U.S. is much more vulnerable than we would have been in 1980 when there wasn't anybody for Iran to target nearby. And a lot of the work that's being done, right, in fighting Iran is being done offshore, right? It's using naval platforms. It's using over-the-horizon capabilities. So it really should raise questions about whether it's smart strategically to have these big bases in the region that can be attacked by countries like Iran.
And President Trump has said he has been surprised by some of the retaliatory strikes by Iran on neighboring countries, bases, U.S. bases in those regions. There's also ways that President Trump is trying to mitigate some of the impacts of this oil and the gas prices, one of them potentially around the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. What factors might he be weighing on that? We saw it depleted during the ongoing war there between Ukraine and Russia. What factors is he weighing to it? Because you may not want to use it solely to lower gas prices.
Yeah, I mean, so this is what the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was created for. But there's a lot of political difficulties in deciding to draw it down. So on the one hand, if Trump draws down from the reserve, he might be communicating that this war is going to be longer than what he intended it to be or what many people thought it would be. It takes 2 weeks for oil from the SPR to make it to the market. So that suggests he thinks the war is going to be at least 2 more weeks. And I don't think that the president wants to commit that necessarily. But then there's also the problem that the whole reason the U.S. is in this mess is because the oil market is a global market. And so if the U.S. releases oil from its stockpile, then U.S. oil from the stockpile lowers the price for everybody in the market, even people who didn't release from their stockpiles. Now, that's why we have the IEA, the International Energy Agency, and a bunch of allies in it who are willing to do a coordinated release. So it's not the case that the U.S. just depletes its stockpile while other people don't and free ride. But then, of course, if you're depleting U.S. and IEA stockpiles, countries like China benefit from that, right? Because China gets to pay lower prices from other people depleting their stockpiles. So it's very complicated politically and strategically thinking about who draws down first and how do you draw down. That said, I think that drawing down from the stockpile would be a wise move.
Yeah, but he also potentially doesn't want to admit, like you mentioned, kind of that 2-week delay, the lag on it. And he said yesterday that this war is pretty much complete, saying it would be over very soon. He wouldn't commit to an exact timeline. He said no, it would end this week, but he said very soon. Might it be more dangerous for the United States to pull back in that way, to let Iran going on? Would it be more dangerous to kind of pull back than to continue forward?
I don't think it's more dangerous to pull back than to continue forward, because Iran, this is a crisis that the United States started, and the United States and Israel started the war. And frankly, this is a war that is a much bigger deal to Iran than it is to the United States, right? Most Americans, they notice the price change at the pump, but for most people, this war isn't affecting their daily lives otherwise. But in Iran, the war is the most important thing. And so Iran has this really big incentive to keep fighting because they care a lot more than the United States does. The U.S. has tried to fight other countries before who had higher interests at stake than we did, and it didn't work out well. This was the main problem in Afghanistan. The U.S. tried to convince the world that it would stay forever in Afghanistan to create a liberal democracy where none existed before. But ultimately, the Taliban waited us out. And it took 20 years, but everyone knew that the Taliban cared more than the U.S. did. And this is the same thing here, right? Iran cares more than the U.S. did. So, we're in a contest where we have superior capabilities, but they have a stronger reason to keep fighting.
Yeah, and you mentioned Iran. Obviously, they're more invested in this. The United States may less so, but Israel right there in the middle, it would probably be leaning closer to Iran, saying they are so invested in this, thinking that Iran is that existential threat. Do you think that might splinter some of the relations? Because we've seen the cooperation between the United States and Israelis during that initial strike, the Operation Epic Fury. Do you think that might cause some tension between the United States and Israel if they don't see entirely eye to eye, potentially about regime change entirely?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, U.S. and Israeli interests are not perfectly congruent in this case. They're almost never perfectly congruent, but they're not perfectly congruent in this case. And, Israel cares a lot more about what happens with Iran because they live in Iran's neighborhood. That said, Israel is a very safe country. It has a nuclear deterrent, so it can deter, really bad behavior from Iran, although it can't deter retaliation from the war that the U.S. and Israel started. But yes, Israel seems very determined to, if not have regime change, then perhaps collapse the Iranian regime. Because if Iran turns into a basket case country, then it cannot mount threats externally to hurt Israel. Then again, if Iran becomes a basket case country, the United States has 40,000 troops permanently stationed in the Persian Gulf, and that's not good for the United States. So there is a difference of interest there that's going to be difficult to manage going forward.
Yeah, uncertainty and instability could be cause for concern in that region. Rosemary, what are you watching over the next several days throughout this week to signal how it's going in the region, how this conflict evolves?
Yeah, so I think really important things to keep in mind are whether the Houthis get involved in the Red Sea. We've seen that Saudi Arabia is shifting a bunch of oil through its east-west pipeline to Yanbu. It's a port on the Red Sea to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. So far, the Houthis have been pretty quiet. But what happens when a bunch of Saudi oil comes into the Red Sea? Do the Houthis get activated? Aside from the Houthis, Iranian missiles can reach the Red Sea. So, what happens there? Is that a chance for Iran to escalate further, to cause more havoc, more chaos in the region and in oil markets? Not clear. I think another key thing is that the IEA is considering a coordinated release of oil, and they're supposed to decide on that tomorrow, Wednesday. And, if they decide to do that, I do think that will calm markets in the short run. Then again, people might look at it and think, well, this signals it's going to be a big, long war. So maybe you actually have a short bump in prices. It's really hard to know when you have such volatility in the market.
Yeah, both those things might indicate a longer runway for this timeline than the president or the White House wants to admit. So interesting to know. All right, Rosemary Kelanic, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, your insight here on Live Now from Fox.
Thank you.